For 11 years, she quietly carried responsibilities that kept an entire company standing without asking for a single raise. Then, during one routine investor review, a stranger asked one simple question no executive could answer. And within hours, HR was carrying a contract no one had expected her to see. Monday morning settled over Alder and Pierce Capital in a wash of cold silver light, turning the glass walls into mirrors and the marble lobby into something almost theatrical. Employees crossed it quickly with coffee cups, tablets, and the alert expressions of people who wanted to look essential before anyone asked what they actually did. On the 20th floor, Emily Carter arrived at 7:57, placed her worn leather bag beneath the same desk she had used for 11 years, and woke her computer before the overhead lights had fully brightened. Her workspace was modest: one family photo, a stubborn green plant, and rows of carefully labeled folders that contained more real knowledge than most executive presentations. Emily was the quiet employee everyone trusted and almost no one discussed. She had never asked for a raise, never demanded a promotion, and never turned a routine problem into a public performance. She simply solved what landed in front of her. Over time, that habit had made her invisible in the most dangerous possible way. The company depended on her so completely that people had stopped noticing the dependency. Her official title still suggested ordinary administrative support, but her real responsibilities had spread far beyond it. Emily maintained compliance records, corrected reporting errors, remembered vendor exceptions, repaired broken approval chains, and knew which archived document could save a department from an external audit. When payroll data failed to reconcile, finance called her. When legal could not locate an old contract, they called her. When a senior manager forgot how a system had been configured after the latest corporate restructuring, he appeared beside her desk with a nervous smile and the phrase, "You probably know this better than anyone." Emily always did. Yet her salary remained near the bottom of the band. Her performance records repeated the same polite words every year, and every promotion cycle passed her desk like a train that never stopped. Reliable, consistent, indispensable. The last word had once sounded flattering. After 11 years, it felt like a lock on the door. The unfairness was rarely dramatic enough to challenge openly. It arrived in small, polished moments. A younger employee received a new title after presenting a process Emily had designed. A manager earned public appreciation for an audit package she had rebuilt over a weekend. Someone from HR congratulated her on being such a steady presence before announcing salary adjustments for an entire team that did not include her. Corporate favoritism wore expensive shoes and spoke in cheerful language. Emily watched colleagues with less experience move into offices with glass doors while she remained in a cubicle, answering their questions in private so they could sound prepared in public. Her manager, Daniel Brooks, insisted he valued her deeply. Whenever promotion discussions came up, he explained that moving Emily would create operational risk. In other words, she was too useful to advance and too quiet to force the issue. The company had turned her long-term loyalty into a discount. That morning, however, the office atmosphere felt different. Conference rooms had been reserved under vague titles. Executive assistants carried thick folders marked "confidential." IT staff checked the boardroom screens twice, and even the coffee station conversations dropped to whispers when senior leadership walked past. A lead investor had arrived for an extended due diligence review connected to a major expansion. The visit was not ceremonial. His team intended to examine performance records, process ownership, compliance history, and whether the company's operations could survive disruption. Managers immediately began polishing reports that had been ignored for months. Emily spent hours correcting inconsistencies between finance and operations, rebuilding documentation that should have been maintained by 3 separate departments, and assembling a complete history of approvals no one else knew how to trace. By late afternoon, she carried 6 heavy binders into the boardroom and arranged them with exact, quiet precision. No executive thanked her. Most of them were too busy rehearsing answers. As Emily left the room, she caught a brief exchange near the door. One director glanced at the binders and told another, "Good, Daniel's team finally pulled this together." Emily paused for half a second, then continued walking. Anger rose in her chest, sharp but familiar, before settling into the same restraint she had practiced for years. She did not correct them. She did not demand credit. She returned to her desk, closed the remaining files, and prepared to leave as the sun sank behind the neighboring towers. Through the boardroom glass, she noticed one of the investors' representatives standing alone beside the table. He opened the first binder, studied the index, then turned several pages with increasing concentration. A minute later, he called someone back into the room and pointed to a handwritten cross-reference Emily had added in the margin. The executive beside him looked confused. Then the investor asked a question no one in leadership seemed prepared to answer. And by the end of that meeting, one name would be impossible to ignore. Dot. The question was simple enough to fit inside a single breath. Who built this control system? For several seconds, no one in the boardroom answered. The lead investor, Marcus Vail, stood beneath the muted glow of the ceiling lights with one hand resting on Emily's binder. Around him sat the CEO, the chief financial officer, 2 department directors, Daniel Brooks, and a representative from HR whose smile had slowly tightened. The polished table reflected water glasses, silver laptops, and faces trained to remain calm under pressure. Yet the silence exposed something no presentation could hide. Everyone understood the system. Everyone had claimed ownership of its results. But no one could explain who had actually designed the process that connected compliance reviews, vendor approvals, audit trails, and performance records across 4 departments. Daniel cleared his throat. It was a collaborative effort. Marcus looked down at the pages again. Then why are all the revisions written in the same hand? The room seemed to shrink. He pointed to a series of dated notes, correction logs, and carefully documented exceptions stretching back almost a decade. Each entry showed the same initials, E.C. The records revealed more than routine administration. They showed someone identifying risks before internal audits found them, repairing gaps after repeated corporate restructuring, and quietly preserving procedures that senior managers had allowed to fragment. Marcus turned another page and found a disaster recovery plan created after a software migration had nearly erased years of historical data. The plan had no executive signature, no project award, and no formal author listed, only Emily's initials beside every completed test. "Who is EC?" he asked. Daniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Emily Carter. She works in operations." "Works in operations doing what?" This time, the answer came from 3 people at once, and none of their descriptions matched. One called her an administrative coordinator. Another said she supported compliance. Daniel described her as a senior operations specialist, although her employment contract contained no such title. Marcus listened without interruption, then asked for her compensation band, promotion history, and formal scope of responsibility. The HR representative began typing, but the faint clicking of her keyboard sounded suddenly loud in the room. What appeared on her screen did not help. Emily's title had barely changed in 11 years. Her salary adjustments were minimal. Her performance records were filled with praise but offered no meaningful advancement. She had been marked critical to continuity in multiple reviews, then denied promotion because no replacement had been prepared. The irony was so clean, it almost felt cruel. The company had documented her value and ignored it in the same files. Across the office, Emily knew none of this. She was still at her desk finishing a vendor reconciliation that had been assigned to a recently promoted manager who had left early for a networking dinner. Most of the floor had emptied. Cleaning staff moved quietly between cubicles, and the city beyond the windows glowed in layers of amber and blue. Emily rubbed the stiffness from her wrist, saved the final spreadsheet, and glanced at the clock. It was nearly 7. She considered leaving the remaining emails until morning, but one subject line caught her attention. Urgent clarification required. Finance had discovered that the investors' team was questioning historical approval data. Emily opened the message, found the missing reference in less than a minute, and replied with the exact file path, date, and explanation. Inside the boardroom, the answer appeared on the CFO's laptop before anyone had finished debating where to search. Marcus read Emily's message twice. It was concise, precise, and free of the defensive language executives often used when they were unsure. He asked whether she had been briefed for the investor review. Daniel admitted she had not. He asked whether she had attended any of the preparation meetings. Again, no. Then he asked the question that finally unsettled the CEO. If Emily Carter resigns tomorrow, how long before someone else can operate these controls without her? Daniel leaned back slowly. That's difficult to estimate. 3 months? No answer. 6? The compliance director looked toward the CFO. Marcus closed the binder. So the company's expansion depends on processes owned by an underpaid employee whose authority, title, and compensation do not reflect her responsibilities, and leadership cannot quantify the risk of losing her. The words landed without drama, which made them worse. No raised voice, no accusation. Just a clear summary of facts already sitting in the company's own documentation. The HR representative began reviewing salary inequality across comparable roles. The gap appeared immediately. Employees with broader titles but narrower responsibilities earned substantially more. 2 had received retention packages within their first 4 years. Emily, whose hidden value supported the entire structure, had never received one. Her quietness had been interpreted as consent, and her loyalty had become financially convenient. Marcus requested a private compliance review of her employment history before the next morning's meeting. He also asked that no one approach Emily until the records were complete. "I don't want a performance," he said. "I want the truth." When Emily finally shut down her computer, Daniel was standing near the elevator. His tie was loosened, and the usual managerial confidence had drained from his face. He thanked her for staying late, then asked an oddly careful question. "Emily, do you still have your original employment contract?" She studied him for a moment.
Yes.
"At home?" "I keep copies of everything." Of course she did. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Daniel stepped aside to let her enter, but before the doors closed, Emily noticed the HR representative hurrying from the boardroom, carrying a stack of printed performance records. Behind her, Marcus Vail remained at the table, reading the final page of Emily's file. By morning, the review would no longer be about whether Emily deserved recognition. It would be about how many people had benefited from making sure she never received it. What HR uncovered next would make 11 years of polite excuses impossible to defend. Have you ever worked with someone who deserved far more than they received? Share your story below and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the full truth finally reaches the boardroom. The rain had not stopped since dawn. Thin streams of water slid down the towering glass walls of Alder and Pierce Capital, softening the skyline into blurred shapes, while, inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing minute. The polished conference table was no longer covered with investment forecasts or expansion plans. Instead, it had disappeared beneath 11 years of employment contracts, performance reviews, salary histories, compliance records, restructuring documents, audit reports, and internal correspondence. What had begun as a routine due diligence review had quietly transformed into something none of the executives had expected. The discussion was no longer about whether the company deserved additional investment. It had become a question of whether the company truly understood itself. Marcus Vail slowly turned another page before placing both hands on the binder in front of him. "Let's remove assumptions from this room," he said calmly. "I don't want opinions anymore. I want evidence." The HR director projected a timeline across the screen, stretching from Emily Carter's hiring date to the present day. At first glance it looked ordinary, but as everyone followed the years one by one, an uncomfortable pattern emerged. Her responsibilities expanded after the first restructuring. They expanded again after another department merged. More systems were assigned to her during software migration. Compliance oversight quietly landed on her desk after a senior specialist resigned. Audit preparation followed. Vendor governance followed. Process ownership followed. 8 documented changes in responsibility. Not a single updated employment contract. Marcus looked toward HR without raising his voice. 8 role expansions? She nodded. Yes. He asked his second question just as quietly. How many formal promotions? The answer came almost as a whisper. None. The room fell silent. Even the CEO leaned forward, staring at the screen as if he were seeing his own company for the first time. For 11 years, every department had solved its problems by giving them to the same quiet employee. Yet somehow no one had ever stopped long enough to ask whether her position reflected the work she was actually doing. Suddenly, the numbers on the screen looked less like administrative records and more like evidence. The deeper HR searched, the worse the picture became. Performance review after performance review praised Emily using almost identical language. Reliable, exceptional attention to detail, critical to operational continuity, trusted across multiple departments. Hidden inside those glowing evaluations, however, sat another column no one had previously compared side by side. The compensation history. Minimal adjustments, deferred reviews, budget restrictions. Revisit next cycle. Marcus slowly placed Emily's salary beside the salaries of managers hired only 4 or 5 years earlier. Several earned substantially more despite supervising smaller teams and carrying fewer responsibilities. One director had received a retention bonus after 3 years. Another had been publicly recognized for improving operational reporting, only for the supporting documentation to reveal that the reporting system itself had been designed, tested, and continuously maintained by Emily. Project after project followed the same pattern. Someone else stood on stage, someone else accepted congratulations, someone else collected bonuses. Emily's contribution existed only in revision histories, audit notes, and documentation buried deep inside archived folders that no executive had ever bothered to read together. The General Counsel finally broke the silence by placing a risk assessment on the table. Operational continuity depends heavily on undocumented institutional knowledge, he said. Marcus continued reading until one sentence stopped him completely. If Ms. Carter were to leave without structured knowledge transfer, several regulatory, reporting, and compliance functions would experience immediate disruption. He slowly lowered the report. "This isn't an employee problem," he said, looking around the room. "This is a governance problem." No one challenged him. Daniel Brooks stared at the table, realizing that every year he had described Emily as indispensable, while simultaneously approving another decision that kept her exactly where she was. The CEO removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Why wasn't I told the scale of this?" Daniel answered honestly for the first time in years. Because we always believed there would be time to fix it later, Marcus answered before anyone else could. There is never a convenient time to correct 11 years of neglect. At that exact moment, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding upstairs, Emily sat quietly at her desk, helping Jason Miller, one of the company's newest operations managers. He had been promoted 6 months earlier and was preparing a presentation for the executive meeting scheduled later that afternoon. His compliance numbers refused to match finance's reports, and frustration was beginning to replace confidence. Emily asked to see the spreadsheet, studied it for less than a minute, and smiled gently. "You're pulling data from the wrong archive after last year's restructuring," she explained, opening a folder Jason admitted he had never known existed. Within moments, she corrected several formulas, restored the missing references, and every discrepancy disappeared. Jason laughed with visible relief. "You probably just saved my presentation." Emily simply replied, "I'm glad it helped," before returning to her own workload, never expecting her name to be mentioned upstairs. Minutes later, Jason walked confidently toward the executive floor, carrying polished slides built on knowledge that wasn't his, while Emily answered another compliance email as though it were any ordinary Tuesday. Upstairs, Marcus gathered every file into a single stack and stood. The room remained perfectly still. "We're finished for today," he said. "Tomorrow morning, before we continue discussing this investment, I want Ms. Emily Carter sitting in this room." Nobody asked why. Nobody argued. The executives understood that the next meeting would no longer be about financial projections. It would be about the one person whose quiet work had been holding the company together all along. Meanwhile, Emily packed her bag, switched off the light above her desk, and walked toward the elevators, believing she had lived another completely ordinary day at work, never imagining that her name had just become the most important subject in the entire building. The following morning, Emily arrived at Alder & Pierce Capital, expecting nothing more dramatic than another overflowing inbox. The rain had passed overnight, leaving the city washed clean beneath a pale blue sky, and the office buzzed with the restrained energy that always followed an important board meeting. She noticed a few unfamiliar faces from the investors' team crossing the lobby, but thought little of it. Investor visits had become common during the expansion process. She greeted the receptionist, collected a cup of coffee, and settled into her desk exactly as she had for the past 11 years. Within minutes, emails began arriving, each carrying its own small emergency. A compliance question from legal, a reporting discrepancy from finance, a request from procurement. Before 9 o'clock, she had already solved 3 problems that would have delayed other departments for hours. To Emily, it felt like any other Wednesday. What she could not see was that upstairs, the executive board had postponed the first agenda item of the day for one reason alone. They were waiting for her. At 9:12 a.m., Daniel Brooks appeared beside her cubicle. He looked unusually formal, his usual confidence replaced by a careful expression that Emily had never seen before. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked quietly. Emily looked up, instinctively wondering whether another audit issue had surfaced. "Of course," she replied. As they walked toward the executive floor, Daniel made several attempts to start a conversation before abandoning each sentence halfway through. The silence only made Emily more uneasy. Employees glanced up from their desks as they passed, sensing that something unusual was happening. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive level, Emily immediately noticed details she had never paid attention to before. The thicker carpet that absorbed every footstep, framed photographs of company milestones, and the large conference room where she had delivered binders countless times, but had never once been invited to sit. Daniel stopped outside the closed doors. "Before we go in," he said, "I want you to know you're not in any trouble." Emily gave a faint, uncertain smile. "That's an oddly specific thing to say." Daniel lowered his eyes. I know. Before he could explain further, the doors opened from the inside. Marcus Vale stood there waiting. Instead of gesturing toward a chair, he stepped forward and offered his hand. Ms. Carter, he said warmly, thank you for joining us. Emily shook his hand, still trying to understand why an investor knew her name. She entered the room to find the CEO, the CFO, the HR director, general counsel, and several board members already seated. Yet something immediately felt different from every meeting she had imagined executives holding. There were no presentation slides, no financial projections, and no polished speeches waiting on the screen. Instead, the center of the table was covered with neatly organized folders bearing her name. For the first time in 11 years, the company wasn't asking what Emily could do for it. It was trying to understand what it had failed to do for her. Marcus waited until everyone had settled before speaking. Ms. Carter, he began, during our due diligence review, we discovered that your work has had a far greater impact on this company than your position suggests. Before anyone says another word, we'd like to ask you something. Emily looked around the room, confused but composed. All right. Marcus folded his hands. Can you tell us, in your own words, what you believe your responsibilities are? Emily took a slow breath. She answered simply, without exaggeration, describing the work she had quietly performed for years as though it were nothing extraordinary. As she spoke, several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Each sentence confirmed what the documentation had already revealed, and each answer made the silence around the table a little heavier. By the time she finished, no one was looking at the reports anymore. They were looking at each other. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence carried far more weight than any carefully prepared presentation ever could. Emily sat with her hands folded on the table, convinced she had simply described an ordinary workday. To her, there had been nothing remarkable about remembering forgotten procedures, rebuilding broken reporting chains, preparing audit documentation, or helping departments solve problems before they became crises. That was the job she believed she had been hired to do. Around the table, however, every executive now understood they had been listening to the person who had quietly connected dozens of critical business functions for more than a decade. Marcus Vale finally broke the silence. Miss Carter, he said, you've spent the last 11 years protecting this company's operations without asking for recognition. The documentation shows that repeatedly. The people in this room have finally seen it. The CEO slowly stood. There was no rehearsed corporate speech, no dramatic gesture, only an expression of genuine regret. Emily, he began, I've reviewed every report from the last 11 years. I can't change the decisions that brought us here, but I can acknowledge them. Somewhere along the way, we confused your loyalty with permanence. We assumed that because you never complained, everything was fair. It wasn't. The admission settled over the room with surprising honesty. Daniel lowered his eyes. The HR director quietly closed the final binder. Nobody attempted to defend the past anymore, because the documentation had already done the talking. The HR director gently slid a single folder across the table. This is not a reward, she said. It's an effort to correct what should have been corrected years ago. Emily opened it slowly. Inside was a new employment agreement reflecting the responsibilities she had already been carrying. Executive Director of Operational Governance. The compensation matched the position. A long-term retention package recognized her years of service. Future performance reviews would be tied to executive leadership rather than administrative support. Every responsibility listed in the contract mirrored work she had been performing all along. Emily read each page carefully, asking several practical questions about reporting structure, transition planning, and documentation ownership before looking up. Marcus smiled faintly. I'm glad you're reading every line. Emily returned the smile. After 11 years of documentation, I don't skip details." Quiet laughter spread around the table, dissolving tension that had been building since the investor review began. She signed only after every question had been answered. It wasn't hesitation, it was professionalism. The same professionalism that had quietly carried the company for more than a decade. Later that afternoon, employees gathered for a brief company meeting, expecting another update about the investor visit. Instead, the CEO stepped onto the stage and spoke without slides. He thanked every team for their work before pausing. "Today," he said, "we're recognizing someone whose contributions should have been acknowledged a long time ago." Emily's name appeared on the screen behind him. A murmur spread across the room. Many employees smiled immediately, while others looked surprised that the quiet woman from operations had become the focus of the meeting. The CEO explained that Emily would now lead operational governance, ensuring the knowledge she had protected for years would become part of the company's future instead of remaining hidden inside one person's memory. The applause began hesitantly, then grew louder as colleagues realized how many times Emily had quietly helped them without expecting anything in return. As the meeting ended, people who had walked past her desk for years now stopped to shake her hand and congratulate her. Nothing about Emily herself had changed. She was still calm, still humble, still more interested in solving problems than standing in the spotlight. But as she walked down the same hallway she had crossed thousands of times before, something around her had changed forever. For the first time in 11 years, people didn't see a quiet employee sitting behind a desk. They saw the person who had been holding the company together all along. And Emily smiled, not because she had finally received a bigger title, but because respect, earned patiently over years of invisible work, had finally found its way back to its rightful owner.